For Triss Merigold, the year 1263 was, well, it was less than ideal. And to get more specific, the month of April was especially challenging for her. For one, she'd recently been dumped by a witcher that some of you might know named Geralt of Rivia. Second though, and this part is maybe a little more important, it was in April of 1263 that Triss was struck and sadly killed by a massive ball of fire. She was burnt from head to toe, her shining red hair was reduced to ash, and what was left of poor Triss was buried in a shallow grave south of Temeria. However, the story of Triss Merigold doesn't end there, because mere days after she was put in the ground, another sorceress began impersonating her. This sorceress, a fellow redhead with bright green eyes, then started going around as Triss, making the claim that she didn't really die, that her head-to-toe burns had been miraculously healed, and that the unidentifiable remains that were buried and assumed to be Triss weren't really her. It was all a big mistake and an unfortunate misunderstanding. That is how the story of the Triss impostor goes, anyway, and I'll say up front that this is a video I've had in mind for a very long time, because in the Witcher community, one of the most popular, out there but based on a decent amount of evidence takes is that Triss, during the events of the games and most of the books, isn't really Triss. That when she was thought to be dead, when a grave was dug for her, and when a monument was built in her honor, all things that really did happen in canon by the way, well, the idea is that when all of that took place, the real Triss Merigold really was dead. And the version of Triss that later in the Witcher story comes out of the woodwork claiming to have survived is actually an impostor, a sorceress named Lidanade who saw an opportunity and assumed Triss's identity following her burial. It's an interesting idea, there's a reason it gets discussed fairly often, and it's because there are enough pieces of evidence supporting it throughout the books and games to make it more than just a total crackpot theory, although, well, we'll get there. First though, let's back up and answer a very important question. What the hell am I talking about? When did Geralt and Yennefer and everyone in the Witcher world think that Triss was dead? Thankfully, that's an easy question to answer, because Triss Merigold's very bad no-good month is something that happens completely off-screen, or off-page, I should say, and it also takes place very early on in the known Witcher story. 9 years pre-Witcher 3, and 4 years before the main events of the books. In fact, Triss's real introduction into the Witcher story happens after her supposed death. That's how early in the timeline we're talking. Long story short, in one of the early Witcher short stories, which take place before the main novels, Geralt learns that 14 mages died during a recent battle, the Battle of Sodden Hill. Panicked that Yennefer might be one of them, Geralt visits the monument dedicated to the fallen 14. Ultimately, he's relieved to see that Yennefer's name is absent, but in its place he finds names like Vaniel of Bruges, Lidanade, and Triss Merigold. Geralt thinks to himself, that's too bad, Triss was a nice girl. From there though, years pass in the Witcher timeline before we ever hear of Triss again, and the first time a character named Triss Merigold physically appears in the Witcher story is when she arrives at a place you guys know, Kaer Morhen, to help with the training of a very young Ciri. And if we're running with the evidence of the Triss as an imposter theory, at this point in the story, when a sorceress who looks like Triss arrives at Kaer Morhen, the real Triss is already dead, even though she reappears with an explanation for being alive. Alive despite being burnt to a crisp at the Battle of Sodden, alive despite a grave being dug for her and a monument built, and alive despite word of her death spreading across the continent. How is her survival explained? Well, according to the red-headed sorceress who shows up at the Witcher's Keep, there was a little mix-up at Sodden. She tells Geralt that by mistake, 14 graves were dug when there were only 13 mages to bury. According to her, both the living and the dead were hard to account for after the battle, which, by the way, is very believable. For quick context, the Battle of Sodden Hill was the big, bloody end of the First Nilfgaardian War. Nilfgaard had tried to push further north and expand their territory, but they were decisively pushed back with heavy losses on both sides. Triss being mistaken for dead after such an event could have easily happened, and she goes on to explain to Geralt that her post-battle burns were so horrible that she was nearly impossible to recognize. To the point where when she was eventually identified, even the best cosmetic healers on the planet were unable to fully heal her scars. She even says that she'll never, ever wear a dress with a low neckline again, because the unhealable scars all over her chest would show. Which is a perfect lead-in to the evidence of this theory, aka the major inconsistencies between the Triss we hear about in the books and the Triss we eventually see in the Witcher games. Inconsistencies that, coincidence or not, all have a lot to do with another sorceress who supposedly died at the Battle of Sodden Hill. Litanade, and I should mention that this theory really does lean on the games. The idea is that CDPR had some fun with Triss's supposed book death, and placed a few Easter eggs in their games that cast doubt on Triss being who she says she is. Now, that said, before we get into all of the evidence, I do need to take just a quick second to thank my favorite sponsor, Factor, for sponsoring this video. And if you don't know, Factor are the meal delivery service, the one you should really consider if you're trying to eat healthy. I've said this many times because it's true, but since October 2023, almost 2 years ago at this point, I've been ordering from Factor out of my own pocket because their meals have solved every food problem I've ever had. If you're like me and you work a lot, you might understand the struggle of just not having time to cook, or even having a spare second really. And the unfortunate thing is that most convenient foods are either unhealthy, prohibitively expensive, or just plain boring. But Factor, well, they're the rare exception because they're none of those things. Factor meals are fresh, they're very affordable, and they're beyond easy to prepare, ready to eat in just 2 minutes. And that's not even to mention that recently, Factor doubled the size of their menu and added a ton of new high-protein and seafood options, so you'll never be bored with what they have on offer. Speaking of, each order you place is fully customizable to your specific needs, from the number of meals to which meals you want each week. I love Factor, and I think you'd like them too, so to get started yourself, head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code NEONFB50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. Plus, and this is new, free breakfast for an entire year. If you're on the fence, just know that you won't be locked in for anything if you give them a try. You can cancel or skip weeks at literally any time with no charge, no consequences, so I'm just personally recommending give that heavily discounted first box a go, and I promise you won't be disappointed. Okay, so the evidence. Why can you find dozens of Reddit posts with hundreds upon hundreds of upvotes theorizing that Triss is an impostor, that Litanade stole the identity of a young up-and-coming sorceress? Now, keep in mind for the next couple of minutes, I'm not going to argue against anything, I'm just going to throw the evidence out there, or at least what people claim is the evidence, and deal with the problems afterwards. So to start, and you might have already picked up on this from earlier in the video, but how Triss is described in the books, which is some of the first information you ever get about her, well, it doesn't really match what we see in the games. Book Triss is described as having bright blue eyes and chestnut hair, aka brown hair that, in certain lighting, looks reddish. In the games though, well, CDPR decided to change Triss's eye color from blue to green, and her hair to, I don't know, fire hydrant red, stop sign red, and you probably already guessed this, but both of those features, while definitely not a match for Book Triss, are an exact match for Litanade, who is described many times as having green eyes and hair so intensely red that it resembled a forest fire or a fox. Why Lita would keep her old eye and hair color when trying to impersonate someone else is anyone's guess, but we're not done with the weird Triss inconsistencies yet, so let's just keep going. This next one you probably caught on to already, but in the books, the Triss who apparently survived Sodden tells Geralt that her chest is so scarred that she'll never wear a low-cut dress again. Jump forward to the games, and not only does she wear the lowest cut clothing maybe ever in both Witcher 1 and 3, but you can also see in several different scenarios that her burn scars just aren't there. Weird. We also have the strange issue of how Triss talks about Lita in the games, when she's mentioned. Now, Lita is only ever brought up in Witcher 3 during a couple of conversations with Triss, and in both cases, for some reason, Triss talks about Lita in the present tense, as if she's still alive. Now, keep in mind that in these clips, Lita is referred to by her nickname, which is Coral. Anyway, here's the first example.
Here, take this. Have a good time. Paint the town coral.
Whose taste has grown worse since you were sleeping with her.
And here's the second.
So Coral enchanted him, just like her.
If there's a more vindictive sorceress, I don't know her. Well, except maybe...
So are these just more mistakes from CDPR? Is it a coincidence that Game Triss has Lita's eye and hair color, that her burns are missing, and that she talks about Lita in the present tense both times she mentions her? On that note, is it a coincidence that Lita in the books has a huge tattoo of a fish on her leg, and in Witcher 2, just before Geralt and Triss sleep together, what does Geralt need to bring her? Tattoo remover. I'm not kidding either. The answer though is yes, this whole theory, despite how interesting I find it, despite how much credit I have to give to the community that pieced it together, it's a theory that unfortunately completely crumbles if you know your Witcher at all. Which, by the way, I've really been enjoying doing Witcher again between the big lore video I did last month and now this. Let me know if you want more. Leaving a like definitely helps push these videos if you do. Anyway, let's run through each piece of evidence one by one with just a few sentences each to dismantle this theory. The theory claims that Triss in the books has blue eyes, whereas Triss in the games has green eyes just like Lydanade. That's totally true, but what this theory completely ignores is that in the books, Triss's eye color isn't revealed as being blue until after the Battle of Sodden, at which point, according to this theory, Triss would already be an impostor with green eyes. CDPR just messed up in Witcher 1 and stuck with it. Her eyes are blue throughout all of the later books, and then they're suddenly green in the games. Plus, I'm not even mentioning that Lyda's eye color wasn't even revealed as being green until 2013 with the prequel book Season of Storms, and 2013 was long after Witcher 1 and 2, so CDPR wouldn't have even known to make Triss's eyes green as an Easter egg if they wanted to. It was just a mistake. This theory also claims that Triss's hair is described as being chestnut-colored in the books, and that's only sort of true because the books themselves are inconsistent. For the first few, her hair is described as being chestnut, but the later books describe her hair as being auburn, which is much more red, and by the final book, her hair is just referred to as being red outright. The whole chestnut brown description is also something of a translation problem from the original Polish version. I won't bore you with the details, but if you need more hard proof of Triss being a redhead, Sapkowski once said in an interview that if he could describe Triss in just a few words, those words would be pretty and red-haired, but insecure. Speaking of pretty, let's talk about Triss's scars. Why are they gone in the Witcher games? And this one also has an explanation. That explanation just isn't in the games themselves. Back in 2011, to promote The Witcher 2, Triss appeared in a certain magazine. In the magazine, there was an interview written by CDPR where Triss was being interviewed. The interviewer asked Triss why her scars from Sodden were gone, to which Triss replied saying, "There are methods us women use in order to look good, but those methods aren't your business." So pretty much saying exactly what you could have guessed anyway, she found a way to hide her scars. As for Triss talking about Lyda as if she's alive in Witcher 3, well, that one I have no explanation for. It's just a mistake from whoever wrote the tiny little questline where Lyda is mentioned. Truth be told though, this is a theory that sounds interesting on paper, but, well, there's no serious way to buy into it if you think at all. If you go back to the book, there's no evidence at all whatsoever of Triss being Lyda unless you're stretching things to an extreme. I mean, certain parts of the books are from Triss's perspective. You're in her head, hearing her every thought, and at no point is there a hint of her being anyone other than Triss. Not to mention that there's a moment in the last book where Triss is surrounded by ghostly spirits, and she feels the presence of her old friend Lyda in the air. So, if you then try to look at how this theory is usually presented, that CDPR were just having some fun and placed a few Easter eggs throughout their games hinting that Triss is Lyda, well, even that just falls apart. The only piece of evidence that survives any scrutiny at all are the moments in Witcher 3 where Triss talks about Lyda in the present tense. And to be completely honest with you, those lines aren't even from the original version of this theory. I found those lines myself when I was working on a video documenting every mistake in The Witcher 3. You know, every time there's a lore mix-up or something that just doesn't make sense no matter how you look at it. I didn't end up making that video because I wasn't sure if enough people would find it interesting, but, well, at least I put some of that video to use here. Anyway though, I think that's all from me today. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribe if you haven't already. My next upload will be Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 related, but after that, I'm thinking of doing a big lore video on Gauntero Dim. There's a lot of interesting material out there that I've never seen covered here on YouTube. Thank you all for watching though, let me know if that's a video you'd like to see. Thanks to my patrons as always for their support, and that's all. See ya.